This is Pamela Smythe from the University of Waterloo. I'm one of the hosts of Beyond the Bulletin, the podcast of internal communications at the university. We bring you news and views from the U Waterloo community. Please spread the word that we're on SoundCloud.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And now the interview from episode 142 of Beyond the Bulletin, originally broadcast on October 28th, 2022. The Waterloo Centre for German Studies launched a new book that is the culmination of years of work and engagement with our local community. Students and faculty interviewed more than 100 members of the German-speaking community to document their experiences in Canada. Most go back to the aftermath of the Second World War. The conversations are reflected in a new book called Germans of Waterloo Region. Here to talk about the new book is James Skidmore, Professor and Chair of the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies and the Director of the Waterloo Centre for German Studies. Skid, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back.
I feel like I need to explain, like I do every time you're on the podcast, that I call you Skid, and probably every single person who knows you on campus also calls you Skid. But you are, of course, James Skidmore.
Yes, I am. I am both.
For those who don't know, what is the Waterloo Centre for German Studies?
Waterloo Centre for German Studies is a research institute at the University of Waterloo. There are a number of research institutes on campus. And it's an endowed research institute, meaning that the funds were raised through fundraising campaigns in the community. And the center supports research in any aspect of German studies. And by German studies, we're not thinking of just Germany, but we're thinking of the German-speaking world. And so we support research we sponsor a book prize, the first book prize of scholars. That's become a very popular activity we undertake. We have a set of scholarships that we offer students to travel for overseas language learning, mainly. And we also then support cultural programming in the community of things of interest that are connected to the German-speaking world.
And I guess one of those things is this new book, Germans of Waterloo Region.
That's right.
Well, congratulations to everybody involved in its publication. Now,
yeah, thank you.
It's not quite a cast of thousands, but there were many people involved. How did this oral history project begin?
Well, not a cast of thousands, but you're right. There are a lot of people involved, and members of the local community, Marga Weigel in particular, a supporter of the center, approached the then director of the Waterloo Centre for German Studies, Matt Schulze, and said they would like to encourage the center or help sponsor the center to do some research into the lives and experiences of German Canadians who came to Canada and came to the Waterloo region in the aftermath of the Second World War. And because a number of German Canadians in the community did come at that time. There have been different waves of migration, if you want to call it that, of German-speaking people to the area. But this latest or last big wave, if you want to call it that, occurred after the Second World War and lasted into the 60s or so. Mm-hmm. And so these people established themselves here, and they wanted the center to conduct an oral history project that would record some of their experiences and undertake to understand a little more about what they went through emigrating from a war-torn Europe or post-war Europe to Canada and reestablishing themselves here.
Why is it important to document that experience?
It's important from a research perspective because there's a lot to be learned about how different populations that go through migration kind of experiences, how those experiences transpire, what happens when communities or peoples emigrate either by choice or are forced to emigrate into new societies, and to understand how that adjustment takes place, what occurs when that happens. It's also important from the point of view of the people who experience that themselves. And I think in the case of the German Canadians, what was important was to have a sense of I guess validation might be the word, that their experiences not be forgotten, that their experiences be recognized in some fashion. And so a scholarly work like this that allows the people to give of themselves in terms of, recounting their experiences, reminiscing about what happened to them, providing that kind of raw data, raw information is important for them, that they get a sense of being heard and listened to. And then the scholars can work on that, and from that help people understand the experiences of these people in particular, and then the more general experiences of immigrants, generally.
Right, because they're coming after the Second World War. So what makes their experience unique or important to learn about?
That's 70, 80 years ago. And you're looking at a world where communication wasn't as instantaneous as today. Maintaining contact and was just much more difficult. I think it's an interesting study in you see in some of the interviews, or you see in some of the information collected, how for these people, as they moved to Canada in the 50s and 60s and then established themselves here, and the society moved along and they did, how their connections to their former homelands changed, very little contact, and then due to changes in communication, due to changes in, the geopolitical situation of Europe, how the contact evolved over time and what have you. So I think that's very interesting. It's also very interesting to understand that the experiences of German Canadians after the Second World War were, difficult. They came as members of a state that had been defeated by Canada and its allies in the Second World War. When you imagine that some of these people were emigrating to the Waterloo region less than 10 years after the end of that war, they experienced some hostility. They experienced some reticence on their own part to be, coming to a society where that they'd just been at war with. It's a very difficult kind of situation, and it's interesting. I guess it's interesting, or it's important to understand how that transpired in some way. We know how it transpired in terms of how the state supported these things and what have you, and programs and whatever were in place to support people in these migrations. But to know how people experienced it firsthand from their own perspective as the immigrants, that can make it even more interesting.
How do you gather this information?
You seek out people who are willing to share their stories with you. And so it's a lot of networking with the community and connecting with members of the community and saying, we're the center's working on this project. Would you like to participate? Some people said no, of course. They didn't want to participate. Many said yes. And you're researching with human subjects, so you have to go through the ethics approval process of the university. That's all done. And then you set up interviews with these folks. The interviews were mostly videotaped. We employed a number of our own students in our department, graduate students, to conduct the interviews.
Oh.
A whole set of questions are kind of organized and put together. Of course, the conversations go off in their own directions, as is often the case, but there were experiences that the research team was interested in. It's all oral, and you need to put it into written form so that you can work with it. Just under 120 people were interviewed. These interviews last an hour or more. And you have this whole body of data that you have to work through. The next aspect of the project was then to write the book. So Matt Schulze and the other two editors, Grit Liebscher and Sebastian Siebel-Achenbach, all from the University of Waterloo, they organized chapters that would deal with particular topics, and researchers from the center would be paired with graduate students to then write these chapters. So, for example, I wrote a chapter with a graduate student in our department, Lisa Rosen, and that was a nice experience, like to do it that way. So, but that's a standard kind of approach to this kind of research. You collect the data, you analyze it, you then present it in some fashion that others can then make use of it.
That sounds like a huge undertaking, almost 120 interviews.
You're interviewing people they're talking about their lives, so you have to be very sensitive about it. This can be quite a change, right, to move from one society to the next under certain circumstances. So it requires a lot of empathy and mindfulness about that. When a person experiences some event, moving from one country to another, and they try to describe it and explain what happened, and it may not jive exactly with the historical record, because that's natural. Any one of us who has to recount what they did a month ago or a year ago or 10 years ago, we'll get things mixed up with regard to dates and all of that kind of stuff. That can then become something that has to be figured out and sorted through in terms of doing this kind of research. That's just one example when you're dealing with oral history.
Was there a common experience that you saw was sort of woven through the stories?
Well, one thing that I was struck by, and this is something that came up in the chapter that Lisa and I wrote, in the old understanding of migration is you leave that country and you move to a new country, and that old country is in the past, and your new country is your present and your future. And more modern theories of migration are understanding that the old country doesn't end and the new country, you're only in the new country. There's a transcultural notion that you're never fully in one or the other society. It's almost like a spectrum where you're kind of floating back and forth between the two in a way. And so then reading some of the interviews, and Lisa did a very good job, for example, of finding the material where some of the respondents spoke to this and understanding how they're sort of in between these two places. They're part of this new society, Canada. They're still connected to their old society, whatever part of German-speaking Europe they came from. And sometimes they're more a part of the one, but at other times, say they go home for a visit, they might, where they originated from, they might feel more attached to that. Around certain holidays, they might feel a real attachment to their old country, to where they originated, as opposed to their new country, Canada. It just reminded me of what any kind of immigrant or refugee might go through in those situations. Years ago, in a previous life, I worked with a refugee aid agency in Saskatoon, and I was a young guy then, and a young buck, and I didn't really understand the world. You would talk to immigrants we were working with then, and they would kind of explain that to me, and I kind of got it, but I kind of didn't. When working on this chapter, for example, it really reminded me of that experience too, and it made it much clearer to me just what a transition it is to shift between societies like that in a more or less permanent fashion. I travel a lot, or I've lived in other places, but it's never had a sense of permanence to it. When you migrate from one country to another, especially after an event like a Second World War, and you're displaced and you're migrating under those circumstances, that feels like such a change in your whole life, your whole outlook.
And what impact did that have on people?
The whole range of impacts you can imagine. Many of the German speakers who settled in Waterloo region were successful in various sectors, automotive trade and manufacturing, property development, things like that. So there's been some very successful stories. Some returned, not many, but some would have returned, and so there's stories about that. A number of people, while they're grateful to be in Canada, they felt a sense of loss of what they had to leave behind in terms of memories, in terms of family in some cases, that sort of thing. There's a whole range of emotions or feelings that people would experience.
How much do they talk about the war and what happened during the war and what they were doing during the war?
A number of the people who were interviewed who were at that point called displaced persons, so what we might today call refugees, were people who had lived in German-speaking areas of Europe that weren't part of what is Germany today. And so they, as the war came to a close and Germany's borders started to shrink again, and there was a real push from the east to push Germany back from its expansion, a number of these people then, as the Soviet troops were pushing westward, these folks then moved ahead of the Soviet and Allied armies to go closer and closer to the heart of Germany. And as a result, they had to leave behind homes and, where their families had lived for generations, and they ended up in Germany. And Germany in the late 40s was not in good shape. The war was over, but there were some hard winters, issues in terms of supplying people with the necessities of life, coupled with the looming Cold War. The breakdown in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the other allies caused problems as well. And so a lot of people just thought that they saw no, especially younger people, would have seen no great future for them in Germany. Because even though they were in Germany where they spoke the language, it didn't necessarily feel like home if they had been forced out of their original, where they'd grown up, say in the former Yugoslavia or parts of Poland or other areas. Being in Germany already felt like they were not a foreign country, but in a place that didn't feel quite like home. Plus the sense that what would be the economic future? What does the economic future look like? What does the political future look like? That spurred then this desire to emigrate.
Well, they landed, though, in a region that already had a very strong German-speaking community. What effect did that have on them?
Well, I think that, that was by design, that they came to an area where there was already a German community that they could connect to in some way. I think it had more of an effect on the German community already present in, say, the Waterloo region. It led to the establishment of numerous clubs, German clubs that now host Oktoberfest, for example. And most of those clubs didn't exist until you had this new influx of primarily German-speaking migrants who then formed clubs that would allow them to reconnect with their previous homeland. So like the Transylvania Club, for example, which supported Germans who came from areas further east of what is now Germany. That had an effect on our city, KW, and surrounding area more so than one might have expected, for example.
Were there any surprises in what was gathered from people?
I think what was interesting is, so a number of the students who worked on the project come to Waterloo to study from Germany. So we have a strong joint MA program, for example, with the University of Mannheim. Mm-hmm. The students who came then were then working on this project. Okay, so a couple of different groups of students were involved. They knew nothing about this German diaspora. They knew about the existence of the German heritage in the area, but they'd never been sort of connected to it in a direct fashion. They may not have met any German Canadians or really understood what it was like for the people to migrate in the 60s, for example, to Canada. And so I think for them, that was not a surprise, but maybe a bit of an eye-opener to learn what people went through in moving to Canada.
Isn't that interesting?
Like, I thought that was one of the best aspects of this project, was that the students would gain a deeper appreciation of German Canadian society, if we can call it that.
What would you like people to take away from the book?
I'd like them to see that the experiences of this community, of the German Canadians, that they're really human experiences. What they experienced as immigrants to Canada is instructive to all of us. One thing we're becoming more and more aware of, or we're just realizing more, is that there is so much migration in the world. human beings are always on the move, and societies are, or groups within societies are migrating to other areas of the world for various reasons: economic, war. They're forced to leave where they're living, what have you. And I think whenever we study any group like that, we gain a greater appreciation for what it means to leave home. For whatever reason, you may want to be leaving home because of good job opportunities or whatever, but you may be forced to leave home because of for whatever reason. But whenever you do that, it's a great adjustment. It may seem like less of an adjustment nowadays because we have instant communication and we have the ability to travel. It's much easier than it was, but there's still it's a whole shift in mindset and in understanding your identity, who you are in relationship to the society you're living in. And you can kind of go from being an insider to an outsider, and you have to come to terms with that, and you have to come to terms with adapting to new language, to new cultural norms. It's important for all of us to understand that's what migrants go through. And then in the Waterloo region context, just understand what a group of people whose presence in the area contributed to what the area is today, to understand their origins and where they're coming from, both literally and psychologically, culturally. I think that's important.
How important was it for this project that it be students and faculty members who are working together on the chapters?
I think it's a good mentorship opportunity for the students. It's not like the students do all the learning and the profs do all the teaching. I learned a lot working with Lisa.
Oh.
And I can only say personally, working with students in that kind of capacity is it's enriching intellectually. And it's enriching personally. I mean, Lisa and I have become friends, and she invited me to her wedding when she got married, which was really, German weddings are small, and to be invited to a wedding like that's really special, and things like that, and I know that others probably had similar experiences, and I think that's just it's one of the best parts of a job like this is when you get to work with the students directly and help them move forward in their intellectual development and in their career, but also just to work on an idea and to see it come to fruition. That's a wonderful experience. Yeah.
Well, the Waterloo Center for German Studies is launching this book the day this podcast episode comes out, October 28th, 2022. Where can people get the book?
The W Print Shop is printing the book for us for the launch. And I expect they'll have some copies available, but via Amazon, so you can get a copy that way. You can also go to our website, wcgs.ca, and you'll find a link to information about the book and where you can order the book.
Great. We'll put a link to that in our show notes.
We expect to have copies available in some local bookstores and things for sure. Yeah.
Well, as you say, it'll provide some insights into the early experiences of people who are a large part of our community.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited for this book, and I'm so pleased that it's out.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. I appreciate the interest and really happy that you've helped tell the story to a few people. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to this interview from the Beyond the Bulletin podcast from the University of Waterloo. You'll find our archive of full episodes on the University of Waterloo website, and select interviews are on the university's YouTube channel. Just look for our Beyond the Bulletin playlist there. Please join Brandon Sweet and me for new episodes on Fridays, and don't forget to tell your Waterloo connections about us.